Bom dia. If I don't speak Portuguese, this is my mother tongue. Okay. His Excellency Haile Mariam de Salem, former Prime Minister of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia and the chair of Agra Board. Mr. Francisco Roca, the president of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Society. Her Excellency, Madame Anne Berth, Norwegian Minister of International Cooperation. My dear sister, you're welcome. Dr. Abebe Haile Gabriel, Assistant Director General, Regional Representative for Africa, FAO. Dr. Martin Fregin, Director of Agriculture of the African Development Bank. Esteemed ministers, members of the STC, Your Excellencies, ministers and former minister present here, my sister, Dr. Agnes Kalibata, Agra President, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol duly observed. It is my honor and privilege to welcome you to the headquarters of the African Union Commission in this beautiful city of Addis Ababa for this high-level conference on food security and nutrition, which is in line with the African Union theme for 2022 on building resilience for nutrition and food security. Felicitations come from His Excellency Musa Faki Mahamat, Chairperson of the African Union Commission. I take this opportunity to express my profound gratitude to the four organizing institutions, the African Union Commission, the International Federation of Red Cross and the Red Crescent Society, the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, and the African Development Bank, ADB, for partnering together to organize this conference. I also want to express my deep appreciation to His Excellency Haile Mariam de Salem, former Prime Minister of Ethiopia and Chair of Agra Board, for agreeing at a short notice to present the keynote remarks in this conference. Thank you very much, sir, for your presence. This event comes at a time when the challenges of hunger, food insecurity, and malnutrition on the African continent are on the rise, with the latest data showing that 1 in 5 people in Africa, that is 20.2% of our population, was facing hunger in 2021. Africa is no doubt facing one of the most alarming food crises in decades. Even before the Russian and Ukrainian crisis, the increasing frequency of severe climate shocks, regional conflicts, and the COVID-19 pandemic were all taking their tolls, disrupting the food production and distribution and driving up the cost of feeding people and family. The situation took an even more dramatic turn with the COVID-19 pandemic, which led to more food insecurity and poverty in our continent. While Africa is yet to fully recover from the socioeconomic repercussions of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Russia-Ukraine crisis poses another major threat to the global economy, with several African countries being directly affected as net importer of foods, fertilizer, and fuel. Russia and Ukraine, both world bread basket, are major players in export of wheat and sunflower oil to Africa through the Black Sea, that was blocked as a result of the crisis. This pushes the price of food, energy, and fertilizer up, fueling inflation worldwide. Even though we witnessed last month the first shipment of Ukrainian grain to Africa as a result of
recording in progress.
As a result of a settlement mediated by the UN and the Turkey in July. The lesson from the both COVID-19 pandemic as well as the
recording in progress.
Implement the African Common Position, because all the issues that we're talking about, financing, infrastructure, are really captured there. We have 43 game-changing, for transforming agriculture on our continent. This is the primary reason that we are here organizing today's conference, so that we can all put heads together to chart the way forward. Short and medium-term support must be programmed in a way that leads to long-term and sustainable transformation of agriculture and food system. Doing so will strengthen resilience, reduce humanitarian needs, boost sustainable local production, diversity crops, and reduce dependency on import. Africa imports $45 billion every year, which is too much. We have all the ecosystem to build on our own, but unfortunately, we are not achieving this goal. So that is why we are here to reflect what is the way forward after all these shocks that we've been going through. The conference today will advocate for scaling up efforts to meet the humanitarian imperative across the continent, while also investing in addressing the longer-term needs to build resilience for African farmers, fishers, folks, and others. It will also make recommendations that will feed into presidential conference on food insecurity to be held early next year, championed by His Excellency, the President Macky Sall, President of the African Union and the President of the Republic of Senegal. The conference will also build on the African Common Position on food system and feed into Africa's positioning at the COP 2027 on impact of climate change on food and nutrition security in Africa. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, a catastrophe is unfolding in the Horn of Africa, here where we are, which has endured 4 consecutive episodes of several droughts. The World Meteorology Organization forecasts a 5th consecutive failed rain season because of drier than average condition expected for October through December 2022. Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia make up 2% of the world's population, yet these 3 countries are home to 70% of the world's most extreme food insecure. Teams on the ground report that people are already dying from starvation. Over 18 million people across Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya are already on the verge of starvation. Half of them children and women. Yet the crisis has struggled to attract the attention and funding it's desperately required. This is why we have in our program a special section on the Horn of Africa. Excellencies, the Commission remains committed to continue working with all relevant stakeholders in realizing healthy and well-nourished African people and encapsulated, in Agenda 2063. Agricultural vulnerability, food insecurity, and malnutrition, it is an imperative to implement the various commitments made by our leaders in Maputo, Sirte, Abuja, and Malabo. In this context, continued support to the comprehensive African Agricultural Development Program, CADEP, meets African head of state aspiration to make agriculture an important lever for growth and sustainable development. At the national level, it is imperative that political leaders, minister present here, provides political support through sustainable investment in agriculture. Maputo Declaration tells us that we need to invest at least 10% in agriculture sector. So I'm making a call that, dear ministers present here, we should really fight that to invest in this sector. It is important because the shocks that we're having, we are seeing the impact. To mitigate this impact is to invest in this sector. In Africa, we need two sectors in this African Union. Peace and security and agriculture should be our priority. So I welcome you once again to the African Union Commission, and I thank you for your presence. Muito obrigada, shukran, merci beaucoup, asante sana, karibu.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, Commissioner Sako. Next is Dr. Martin Fregene, the Director of Agriculture at the Africa Development Bank. Martin.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'd like to begin by recognizing the presence of Honorable Minister of Agriculture of Ethiopia, Honorable Usman Hussein, and also to recognize our governor from the bank, Minister of International Development, Norway, Honorable Anne Svivenerem. Allow me to, and also Her Excellency, the Commissioner of Agriculture, Ambassador Sako, and also Helimariam Desalegn, the Chairman of AGRA, and Francesca Roca, the President of the International Red Cross. Allow me to stand on existing protocols. We all know that 2020 till now, there has been a conspiracy of COVID-19, climate change, and crisis, the Ukraine war, that has convulsed food production and food prices and food supply on the African continent. We also know that many import-dependent countries in Africa have seen household budgets for food rise astronomically. These household budgets were already high. 60% of many households in Africa spend their income on food. This has been compounded by these 3 C's I mentioned earlier: COVID-19, climate change, and the crisis. Understandably, food is now very high on the agenda of the UN, the AU, as you heard this morning from Ambassador Sako, and also regional and international development, multilateral development banks. It has been said, never let a crisis go to waste. I think this is the perfect storm for food security in Africa. Is also a huge opportunity. We have seen how Europe, because of the Ukraine war, has made far-reaching reforms in the energy sector that could earlier not have been possible. We also on the African continent, we need to take opportunity by the horns. At the African Development Bank, we are trying to contribute, working with the AU and also working with several other partners. We are trying to help Africa take advantage of its vast savannas, numerous rivers, and manpower to transform the continent's lands into food bread baskets, both for itself and for others. On May 20th, 2022, our board of directors approved $1.5 billion for an Africa emergency food production plan. This plan was put together in collaboration with the AU at a high-level ministerial meeting on the 19th of May, where African Ministers of Agriculture and Finance mentioned that there was a need to take immediate action to ensure that Africa doesn't suffer from the loss of 30 million tons of food that comes from Russia and Ukraine. Between the approval of the $1.5 billion in May and today, the bank has approved 25 individual country loans and grants worth $1.3 billion. This money is supposed to provide 20 million farmers fertilizer and seeds to raise local food production. This money is also supposed to help finance supply of fertilizer, given the very high prices, finance traders and other large importers of fertilizer into the continent. But the emergency intervention is not enough. That is why, working with the AU, the chairman of the AU, we have called a conference late January in Dakar, where we want to commit both the countries and development partners. We all want to commit to raising food production and fixing the structural problems that African agriculture has always faced all along until today. The Dakar meeting, which we have dubbed Mission 1 for 200, that is raise $1 billion for most countries and produce 200 million tons of food across the continent. We believe, and we invite all of you to come and join this new effort. It builds upon the success stories that has happened, for example, here in Ethiopia. We all know how Ethiopia has become a self-sufficient in wheat production in the last 4 or 5 years. Heat-tolerant varieties have expanded Ethiopia's wheat production area into 650,000 hectares of lowland irrigated areas that otherwise could not produce wheat. Ethiopia this year did not import a ton of wheat. Next year, Ethiopia is hoping to export wheat. The success in Ethiopia has been a combination of technologies, as I just mentioned, heat-tolerant varieties, combination of government commitments, combination of financing for farmers, also a combination of extension. We can replicate this all across the continent and make sure Africa doesn't import a ton of food again. That is why the meeting in Dakar is going to commit governments and commit development partners and commit NGOs that support agriculture like Sasakawa, 1 Acre, to achieve what was thought impossible in Ethiopia, but today is now possible, self-sufficiency in food production. In closing, I want to thank the organizers of this particular meeting, the AU, the Red Cross, the African Development Bank, and the FAO for putting on the front burner the issues of food. It's not rocket science, food production. We can produce food in Africa, and we can also ensure that our children and our women and men are well fed. What it takes is the commitments. What it takes is the determination. What it takes is the technologies. And what it takes is the infrastructure. What it takes is the finance to make this happen. And I believe this discussion will further that effort. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin, from the African Development Bank. Next is Dr. Abebe Haile Gabriel from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations.
Thank you, Godfrey. His Excellency Desalegn Haile Mariam, former Prime Minister of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia and Chairman of the Agra Board, Excellency Ambassador Joseph Asako, Commissioner for Agriculture, Rural Development, Blue Economy and Sustainable Environment of the African Union, Mr. Francisco Roca, President of the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, Her Excellency Ms. Anne Beth Tvin Nero, sorry for my mispronunciation of your name, Minister representing Norway. I want to also recognize our host, His Excellency Umar Hassan, Minister of Agriculture of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, my colleague, Dr. Martin Fregene, Director of Agriculture and Agro-Industries of the African Development Bank, honorable ministers present, distinguished participants, dear colleagues. On behalf of Dr. Chu Dongyu, the Director General of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, FAO, I wish to join our partners in welcoming you to this timely and important high-level conference on food security and nutrition. Africa is moving backwards in its efforts to end hunger, food insecurity, and malnutrition. 1 in 5 people in Africa is going hungry, as Her Excellency Commissioner has alluded to, and more than 1 billion Africans cannot afford a healthy diet. This situation is not sustainable. The latest report on the state of food security and nutrition in the world, which was co-authored by FAO, showed that Africa is bearing the heaviest burden compared to other regions. About 278 million people in Africa faced hunger in 2021. This is an increase of 13 million more people compared to the 2020 level, and 46 million more people compared to 2019, which is a pre-COVID-19 year. More people slid into chronic hunger in 2020 than in the previous 5 years combined, signaling that recovery from the socioeconomic impacts of COVID-19 is an enormous and ongoing challenge in Africa. On top of COVID-19, we are facing multiple and overlapping shocks and protracted crises in Africa. Climate extremes continue to severely impact economies and livelihoods, such as the drought in the Horn of Africa region. Conflicts and wars continue to wreak havoc on the lives and livelihoods of millions of people, as well as economies of countries. Excessive dependence by many countries on imports of basic commodities, such as food and strategic agricultural inputs, such as fertilizer, has exacerbated vulnerabilities to the impacts of the war in Ukraine, leading to a rising cost of living. What has exposed the economies and livelihoods in Africa to such adverse uncertainties and risks is the lack of strong mechanisms and capacities to withstand and mitigate the impacts of these multiple shocks. We are now only 8 years away from the 2030 deadline to achieve the SDGs, or just 8 annual harvests. According to FAO projections, more than 670 million people will be hungry globally by 2030. This is the same prevalence as when the 2030 agenda was launched in 2015. 310 million people of the total will be in Africa. We cannot Let that be our legacy. We must do more and now to reverse the trend of hunger. And the good news is that there exist solutions that work. It's encouraging to note that governments are taking actions to respond to these challenges, and international partners have been putting in place mechanisms and facilities to support this effort. Martin just mentioned the example of the African Development Bank. It's important that these efforts reinforce priorities identified in the food system's national pathways. There should be no reinventing of the wheel, nor for duplicating of efforts. We need to work together. Let's complement each other's efforts while recognizing and supporting national and regional African leadership. We need to scale up proven solutions. An example of a good solution is underway in northeast Nigeria, which I had an opportunity to visit 2 weeks ago, and where multiple and overlapping crises have hit food security and livelihoods. There, FAO is collaborating with vulnerable communities, government, and partners in protecting and promoting agriculture-based livelihoods. For example, evidence shows that a support package of seeds and fertilizer costing $88 on less than a hectare of land yielded crops, maize, and cowpea, which is enough to feed an average of household of 7 people for up to 6 months. $88 investment. A vegetable production package of improved seeds, tools, and fertilizer costing $93 has contributed to better and direct access to nutritious vegetables for households for up to 4 months. A fuel-efficient stove and 2 kilograms of briquette costing just $30 led to a reduction of firewood consumption by 58% and increased safety for women and girls by halving the number of trips needed to collect firewood. A livestock package of 4 goats per household costing $326 grew to a herd size of up to 10 goats within just a year, worth around $640 on the local market. These examples are significant. What is more, such experiences are not isolated and they can be scaled up. These livelihood kits are not handouts. They are investments that actually paid off in terms of better production, better nutrition, a better environment, and a better life, leaving no one behind. Let's work together to bring to scale such innovative and life-saving, livelihood-strengthening solutions. For these efforts to bear fruit on a larger scale, policy support is indispensable. The enabling environment is key for success, one that keeps pace with the speed of change and the requisite acceleration of implementation. We must harness the power of science, innovation, data and analysis, and strengthen mutual accountability. Indeed, Africa could be a global leader in agriculture and agribusiness. According to data from FAO's Africa Open Data on Environment, Agriculture, and Land project, which we collaborated with the African Union, Africa has more than double the area of cultivated land compared to the European Union. We also have an enormous wealth of potential in our young people who can become the next agribusiness entrepreneurs and leaders if provided with the right opportunities. FAO recommends a number of steps to be taken now. Policy actions to diversify source of food suppliers and domestic production, improve effectiveness and efficiency of social protection programs, increase efficiencies in the use of agricultural inputs, including fertilizer, such as through the use of soil maps which Ethiopia has been practicing as a good example, reduce food loss and waste along the food supply chain by developing innovative solutions, including changing consumer behaviors, and avoid imposing ad hoc policy reactions when food prices increase. However, the effectiveness of policies depend on the incentive structures that they transmit to producers and consumers. In conclusion, let me raise 3 points for consideration during today's deliberations. First is the need to treat food insecurity as a national security threat, taking into consideration the imperatives of reducing Africa's current dependence on imports of strategic commodities. The question is whether national securities have not already been undermined by such vulnerabilities. The second is recognizing that investment finance is a real constraint due to the narrow fiscal spaces and mounting debt distresses, limiting the capacity of governments to increase budgets for investment in agri-food systems transformation. The third is the plausible way out, which is the imperatives to address structural issues more strategically, including taking advantage of emerging and existing opportunities being made available by partners to operationalize the food systems pathways. In this respect, Africa needs to fix the incentive structure to enhance its agri-food production capacity. This may include, for example, repurposing resources to prioritize sustainable production and consumption. This would also help make healthy diets less costly and more affordable for all. African countries need to use the African Continental Free Trade Area to enhance production capacity, competitiveness, without which trade won't happen. Africa also needs to embrace science and innovation to drive the agri-food systems transformation agenda, including being more intentional in improving business models, financing mechanisms, partnerships, and advocacy. Finally, African countries should seek and enforce mutual commitment and accountability to actions and results. Time is running out, and we must move towards accelerated action. We cannot allow Africa to slip further into hunger under our watch. I thank you.
Thank you, Bebe, for your statement. Now I invite Mr. Francesco Rocca, the President of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, to make your statement.
Excellencies, honorable ministers, distinguished delegates, Red Cross and Red Crescent colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honor and pleasure for me to be here today and together with all of you to open this important event on the food security crisis that we are facing in Africa. This conference is a unique platform that we, co-conveners, provide to leverage support from the political, humanitarian, and development actors, as well as the international financial institutions. And we are particularly honored by the close cooperation of more than a decade with the African Union Commission. Through you, Your Excellency Commissioner Sako, I commend the leadership of the African Union and pledge our continued commitment as a federation to strengthen our good partnership. Thank you very much. And yet, while we address the complexity of food security and nutrition, we must equally not forget hearing from those at the front line of risk and the most marginalized and hard to reach communities. I represent the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, the world's largest humanitarian network, composed of 192 national societies, constituting 14 million of volunteers worldwide, prepared, committed, and ready to respond to disasters and crises at local, national, and regional scale. And our network brings voices from the front lines of disaster and solution communities offer. We, the IFRC, champion localization and national ownership in practice on the ground as a necessity across the world. Empowering local actors, such as our Red Cross and Red Crescent volunteers, makes us able to save lives and reach more vulnerable people. Our volunteers, they volunteers are part of the local communities. They know the needs and how to better address them. And bringing humanitarian assistance to families who are constantly on the move is one of the greatest challenges aid workers face. And for example, I'm very proud of the Red Crescent teams in Somalia, work closely with nomadic communities, and therefore there is never a question about where to deliver aid. And these volunteers come from the communities they serve, and they know how to do it better than anyone else. And as a global network, we are deeply concerned by the unfolding food and security crisis in Africa, where 100 million people are a threat across the continent and 146 million are in acute need of food. Hunger is one of the most, I would say maybe the most dignified sufferings of humanity. The situation is expected to deteriorate into 2023, and we must all be worried, but most importantly, mobilize ourselves to prevent any catastrophes. There is no more time to waste. Words and political commitment must be translated in urgent actions. And we are also mindful that this crisis is not an African crisis, but a global crisis triggered by 3 global factors: climate change, socioeconomic consequences of COVID-19 pandemic, and worldwide impact on commodities and price of the international armed conflict in Ukraine. And African national society, with the support of the FC, have not waited for this situation to deteriorate to act. In 2021, 4.8 million people were supported with cash and food assistance. And as the Red Cross Red Crescent movement, we are also aware that we need to scale up our response. And the FRC has launched a regional emergency appeal for 200 million Swiss francs that covers 23 affected countries and is focused on reaching 7.6 million people in 14 priority countries. To break the vicious circle of this food crisis, the IFRC will not only invest in crisis response, but will work together with the African Union Commission and other key partners on advocating for scaling up efforts to meet the humanitarian imperative across the continent and address the urgent necessity to also invest in addressing the longer-term needs. And we will do it, and we will act in line with the African Union Agenda 2063, the African Union Member States Response Plan across the continent, and the strategic plans of regional economic communities on food security. For us, this is a global crisis. We are mobilizing all our 192 members to support actions led by the African national societies. Here today, we have 15 African national society leaders, plus representation from the Cross Crescent partners from other continents. And we are fully engaged as one team to ensure that both emergency response and longer-term solutions to the food crisis are in full alignment with government's plans and priorities. As auxiliary to public authorities, our African national societies are engaged in mobilizing, training volunteers and capabilities and leverage their unique access to and acceptance by affected or at-risk communities. They also contribute to policy frameworks such as the Global Zero Hunger commitments and the implementation of Paris Agreement, ensuring community-centered response for lasting impact. And this crisis cannot be handled by one agency or organization alone, not in the short term, not in the long run. Strong partnerships, including with the communities themselves, are the foundation for succeeding in our common goal of achieving zero hunger, a big ambition for all of us to deliver against the Sustainable Development Goals and Africa Agenda 2063. Collectively, we are also ready to support African-owned and led longer-term solutions to food insecurity challenges. And it is in that spirit that we launched our IFRC Pan-African Zero Hunger Initiative, a partnership platform to address root causes and to strengthen community resilience through longer-term programming. The aim of this initiative is to reach the 25% of the most vulnerable people in Africa by 2030 through local, national, regional, and international partnership. Ladies and gentlemen, we are witnessing a catastrophic humanitarian crisis. Hunger is a very undignified crisis. Hunger is not just a food crisis. It leads to health crisis and livestock crisis. It means breaking up neighborhoods and disrupting the local communities. It means population movement. An emergency response alone will not end this hunger crisis. So while addressing urgencies needs, it is essential to set the foundation for resilience. More efforts must be made by governments, private sector, and humanitarian and development groups to support long-term food security, livelihoods, and resilience plans. Measures must include investments in strengthening grassroots food system and investment in community actors to sustainably achieve food and economic security. And one of the approaches to consider is anticipatory action for food security based on forecast and the risk analysis. And unfortunately, this is not the first time that we are repeating this. We, the IFRC, stand ready to do our part with governments and partners. And we believe that this high-level event can be a key moment to strengthen our cooperation and save more lives. As we all know, responding late will mean immense suffering for millions and millions of people. And to us, this is unacceptable. Thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Roca. The next two interventions are Goodwill messages, and the first one is via video by His Excellency Ambassador Gabriel Ferrero, who is the chairperson of the Committee on World Food Security. The video, please.
Development, blue economy, and sustainable environment. Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, receive warm greetings from the UN Committee on World Food Security in Rome. I commend you, Ambassador Sacco, and the IFRC leadership for convening this meeting, which is timely. I would have loved to join you in person, but your meeting coincides with the 50th session of the CFS plenary, taking place this week here in Rome. Today, we are not only facing a food crisis, we have a cost of living crisis that is impacting all of us in multiple dimensions. The interlinked shocks of the COVID-19 pandemic, worsening effects of climate change, and conflicts, including the war in Ukraine, have destabilized global food, energy, and finance systems. While the current challenge is one of food access, we are likely to face a food supply and availability crisis in 2023 and beyond, unless we restore global supplies of inputs, including fertilizers. Amidst these challenges, Africa gives me hope. Through the leadership of the African Union and NEPAD, UFAD GADAP, which offers the most coordinated continental agricultural development plan, harnessing the potential of your smallholder farmers, family farmers, small and medium enterprises, and supported by governments and partners. I am confident to say that achieving sustainable global food security will depend largely on the future of African food systems. Now we must act together, ensuring that all our actions to address the crisis are aligned and converge in support of your regional and national-led solutions. Our actions must, first, direct support to smallholder and family farmers, cooperatives, and small and medium enterprises who produce 80% of the food the world eats. We must build the resilience and sustainability of our food systems by empowering farmers to access inputs, technology, knowledge, insurance, and finance. Second, reinforce social protection systems that are needed to prevent a slide into poverty of those in vulnerable situations, including through well-proven nutrition-focused social protection schemes, such as school meals or cash transfers. Third, restore global food and inputs trade to stabilize food prices and ensure fertilizers flow into markets to avoid a global decrease on crop yields next year. Fourth, equip countries with the financial resources, fiscal space, and funds to support and protect people and family farmers, while speeding up the transition to more resilient and sustainable food systems. Fifth and last, ensure that food is accessible and secured in all humanitarian contexts around the world. The Committee on World Food Security, that I have the honor of chairing, is ready to support your work. CFS is the global food governance body of the United Nations, where 137 member states of the UN, including most of your countries, are joined by civil society, private sector, research and academia, UN agencies and programs, international financial institutions, foundations, and others, to deliberate upon and drive convergence on global policies to address systemic and structural causes of hunger and malnutrition in support of the country-led efforts. As I conclude, I wish you very good discussions and look forward to strengthening our collaboration with the African Union, which Ambassador Sacco and I have started. I thank you.
We thank Ambassador Ferrero for his goodwill message. The next goodwill message is by High Excellence Ms. Anne-Beth Vinereim, the Norwegian Minister for International Development. Your Excellence, you have the podium.
Excellencies, honorable ministers, dear colleagues, dear friends. It is my absolute pleasure and honor to participate at the high-level Food Security and Nutrition Conference here in Addis Ababa. It is a particular pleasure because what we are about to discuss here today is at the very top of my priorities as Norway's Minister of International Development. You have put great efforts in bringing together some of the most important actors in the field of food security. And I am thrilled to see so many true advocates, activists, supporters, leaders, and friends who, I am sure, together will create a solid foundation and a conducive atmosphere for a successful conference. The timing of this conference could not have been more pertinent. The food security situation in too many African countries is extremely challenging. Increasing numbers of simultaneous conflicts, high levels of poverty, extreme weather conditions as a result of climate change weakens the existing mechanisms to secure access to food for millions of people. And as previous speakers have pointed out, the impact of COVID-19 and the last month's increase in prices on fertilizers and fuels due to the ongoing war in Europe only exacerbates the situation further and increases food security. In such a context, it's of paramount importance to increase the level of food self-sufficiency as much as possible. This is, of course, in line with the African Union's decision from 2021 to focus on better adaptation and strengthened resilience for food security and nutrition. Sustainable local production is fundamental for resilience. Africa has the potential to substitute expensive imports by becoming a breadbasket for its region and the world. As our colleague from the African Development Bank rightly pointed out, this is also an opportunity for Africa. And I applaud the African Union Commission and other partners for playing a crucial role in putting this topic of food security on the international agenda. An increased focus on this topic of food security and agriculture is necessary to scale up the joint long-term efforts to better meet the agricultural and food-related challenges on this continent. And I would like to thank the African Union Commission, the IFRC, the FAO, and the African Development Bank for bringing us together on one of the most important topics for our and future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Minister, for your goodwill message. Yes, thank you, Honorable Minister, for the goodwill message. And now it is my honor and singular pleasure to invite His Excellency Haile Mariam Desalegn, the former Prime Minister of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia and Chair of AGRA, to give his keynote address and also officially open the conference. Your Excellency, you have the podium.
Honorable Ministers of Agriculture of the AU member states present today, Excellency Madam Anne, Norwegian Minister of International Development, Your Excellency, welcome to the African capital, Addis Ababa. Co-conveners of this conference, Excellency Ambassador Commissioner Joseph Asako, Excellency Dr. Abebe Haile Gabriel, Excellency Mr. Francisco Roca, and Excellency Dr. Martin Frejene, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure and privilege and also honor to present the keynote address to this high-level conference, and I thank the organizers for the invitation. This conference could not have come at a more opportune time, as the world is witnessing an unprecedented global hunger crisis prompted by overlapping factors such as conflict, climate extremes, and COVID-19 pandemic, massive public debt burden, and since February this year, the geopolitical tension as a result of the conflict of Ukraine and Russia. This conference comes at a time when the continent is preparing to host COP27 in Egypt next month. It is organized after the recently concluded United Nations General Assembly in New York and after the premier African Food System Summit, AGRF 2022, where in all these gatherings, we deliberated opportunities and challenges to address the critical food and nutrition security in our continent. Currently, 1 in 10 people, up to 28 million people, are hungry, according to 2022 edition of the State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World, SOFI 2022. Food systems are in crisis due to conflict, climate change, the economic effects of COVID-19, and skyrocketing food, fertilizer, and fuel prices. With the lingering effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on economies and livelihoods, where a recovery so far has been unequal and marginalized, and the groups marginalized continue to struggle disproportionately, and extreme weather events becoming increasingly frequent, food systems are unable to yield adequate, safe, and diversified nutrition food for all. Africa has not been spared, and the situation is indeed precarious. The most recent estimates from the 2022 SOFA report indicates that 1 in 5 people in Africa, that is 20.2% of the population, representing 278 million people, equivalent to slightly more than a third of all the people facing hunger in 2021 were in Africa. Comparable figures for other continents are only 9.1% in Asia, 8.6% in Latin America and the Caribbean, 5.8% in Oceania, and less than 2.5% in Northern America and Europe. The report also shows that 80% of Africans cannot afford a healthy diet on a daily basis. Africa has also become a victim of a distant war. The main buyers of grain from the Black Sea region are largely in the Middle East and Africa, with some 30 countries relying on Russia and or Ukraine for over 30% of their wheat imports, according to FAO sources. Before the war, African countries imported 44% of their wheat from Ukraine and Russia. The Horn of Africa faces a profoundly alarming hunger and hunger crisis, worse than in 2011, when famine claimed several lives. Areas of Eastern Ethiopia and Southern Ethiopia and Northern Kenya and Somalia and Eastern South Sudan and beyond are experiencing an unfolding full-scale catastrophe as a result of 4 successive seasons of failed rains in the East African region, a situation not seen in the, at least in the last 40 years. The Sahel faces its worst food crisis in 10 years, with over 27 million people suffering from hunger. To feed its growing population, Africa spends about 45 billion annually, US dollar annually, on food imports, and this trend means that we might reach 110 billion USD in 2025 if nothing is done, especially as we are beginning to experience strains in global supply chains. Indeed, we can expect not only famine, but also social unrest in many parts of Africa if we do not act now. Swift and decisive actions are needed to ameliorate the situation. Therefore, we must find ways to address the core systemic challenge to ensuring food and nutrition security on the continent, taking advantage of African Union 2022 theme of the year on building resilience on nutrition and food security. We need to take advantage of Africa's ownership of 60% share of the global uncultivated land in agriculture, bargaining youth population, vast ocean territories with 38 coastal states, and the newly minted African continent free trade agreement to reform Africa's agriculture, not just to feed Africa's 2.4 billion by 2050, but the entire world. Excellencies, let me conclude by identifying some areas where, to my mind, the conference should concentrate in finding solutions. First, we need rapid and adequate support to people vulnerable to food insecurity through humanitarian assistance along effective domestic fiscal measures. We must prioritize fighting inflation and protecting the most vulnerable to alleviate the burden of the cost of living crisis. Near-term social assistance should focus on providing emergency food relief or cash transfers to the poor, such as those recently introduced by Djibouti and Sierra Leone. Where this is not possible, second-best subsidies and tax measures can provide temporary relief. Second, maintaining open trade, including regions, within regions, to allow food to flow from surplus areas to those in need. We should build on the progress made under the Black Sea Grain Initiative and at the 12th Ministerial Conference of the World Trade Organization by urgently phasing out export bans imposed by major food producers. For Africa, we must step up implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement through opportunities like ATEX that would be discussed at this meeting, as increasing trade finance and reinforcing supply chains is vital to addressing the current food price shock. Third, we must find ways to transform Africa's food systems, which have been defined by vulnerability to multiple and overlapping shocks and threats, taking advantage of the recommendations of the last year's Food Systems Summit and assisting member states to implement the African Common Position on Food Systems. Indeed, this was part of our preoccupation at this year's AGRF, Africa's premier Food Systems Summit that was held in Rwanda last month. Recently, I was invited by His Excellency Moussa Faki Mohammed, the chairperson of the African Union Commission, to speak to the mid-year coordination meeting of the AU and REX in Zambia. And I shared with the leaders the necessities to coordinate our efforts under the leadership of our union to deliver the desired transformation. There is a sense of urgency and innovative approach needed here if we are able to transform the continent's agriculture and food systems. I shared my proposal on a dedicated institution like AGRA to be affiliated to the African Union system to complement REX and AUDA NEPAD to bolster and respond to the continent's recurrent challenge. Fourth, it is well known that crop yields are much lower in Africa compared to the rest of the world. This has led to the need for the continent to import a large share of its food needs. We must tackle how to improve on food production through increased in yield, including through ensuring adequate access to fertilizer, seeds, and other critical inputs, as was reported by my colleague from FAO. Finally, investing in climate resilient agriculture will be vital to increasing future harvests as more intense and more unpredictable climate events are increasing food insecurity. African countries are among the least prepared to face the effects of climate change. Solutions should be tailored to country circumstances with a focus on low cost, high impact measures, such as investing in new crop varieties, improving water management, and information dissemination. Ethiopia, Kenya, and Rwanda are already leveraging mobile technology to provide farmers with rainfall forecasters to optimize the planting of crops and the purchase of crop insurances. There are innovative mechanisms like agricultural commercialization cluster in Ethiopia, where the wheat production is showing a dramatic increase. We must all act now to ease the suffering of those experiencing hunger and work on aggressively to ways to transform our food systems by supporting countries that take strong policy action with the innovative financing they need. Our development partners should come forth to support in a meaningful and significant manner the Continental Initiative and that of respective countries' flagship programs. With this, I now declare that the conference is officially open, and I thank you and God bless you all.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. The messages are quite loud and clear, calling for action. I don't have time to summarize, but if there are two takeaway messages for me, the first, listening to all the speakers expressing concern about the alarming food security crisis on the continent, 1 billion people on the continent cannot afford a health diet. And if you cannot consume a health diet, that means you cannot be a productive citizen. That's a strong message to take away. We also had the solutions exist. In the short term, we need to take care of the most vulnerable among ourselves by having safety net programs that protect them, including food relief and cash transfers in the short term. In the medium term, all the speakers talked about increasing food production towards Africa's food sovereignty, reducing food losses, increasing trade in agricultural commodities, food and agricultural commodities on the continent, promoting supportive policies and policy reforms, and that all these are contained in the Africa Common Position to the UN food systems that was presented by Her Excellency Ambassador Josefa Sako during the UN conference in September last year. And if you haven't had the chance to look at that, please have access to it. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of this opening session. What's going to happen now is we are going to go for a group photo in front of this Mandela Hall. So basically you exit through those two doors that you came through. Please give priority to our dignitaries on the podium, as well as honorable ministers representing our member states and ambassadors, and the rest of us can stand behind. At the same time, the co-conveners will be going to a press conference. Somebody will come to you and take you to the press conference. So we have taken a little bit more time. So we are going to have about 20 minutes or so for coffee break as the co-conveners are holding the press conference. So let's plan to come back here at 10 to 11. 10 to 11, please come back to the hall for the next session. But right now, it is a group photo. Oh, correction, the press conference is going to happen in here. So the co-conveners, please remain in this hall as the rest of us go outside to take a photo. I guess everybody should go for the photo. Then the co-conveners come here for the press conference as the rest of us have coffee and tea. Bon appetit, and we see you at 10 to 11.
I need your help to arrange the next session. The next session, are they sitting here or here?
of the high-level food security and nutrition conference, which is being held here at the African Union in Addis Ababa. So the sessions started yesterday, and this morning, the main conveners and invited guests had a session which set the context of this very important conference. So here with me, we have 4 conveners of the conference, and they are here to provide key strategic information around which the media can make follow-ups as takeaways from this conference. My name is Wayne Musabayana. I work here at the African Union Commission. So our format will be that we will give each of the panelists 3 minutes to give us their main key points, after which we will then go into a question and answer section. That Q&A will primarily be for those who are here with us physically in this Nelson Mandela Hall, although we have colleagues who are joining us online, and I also want to extend a very special warm welcome to them. So we have the Commissioner for Agriculture, Rural Development, Blue Economy and Sustainable Development, Her Excellency Ambassador Josepha Sako. She will be followed by Dr. Beth Danford, who is the Vice President of Agriculture, Human and Social Development at the African Development Bank. Following that will be Dr. Abebe Haile Gabriel, who is the Assistant Director General and Regional Representative for Africa for the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Then finally, we will hear from Mr. Francesco Rocca, who is the President of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. After that, we will have our Q&A. At this moment, let me bring in Her Excellency Ambassador Josepha Sako for her 3 minutes of the main points that she would like the media to take away. Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, moderator, dear sister. Good morning. I think we're still good morning, every one of you, and thank you for organizing the press conference. And it is through the media that we can really disseminate and do our advocacy about the situation that the continent is facing. We are all aware that food insecurity is really an issue in Africa. For the past 5 years, we've been having one shock upon the others. We have the current Russia and the Ukraine crisis, but before that, we have still the insecurity in our country, conflicts in our continent. We also have pests and diseases that are devastating this sector, and being agriculture, being a rain-fed pattern, we have the climate change issue. So all these issues are really very serious when you look at the statistics. According to the recent report of the state of food security and nutrition in the world, the report is telling us, is informing us that hunger continues to rise in Africa. As leaders of this continent, I think this is the time for us to really take action, because we cannot allow our people to die and we be just silence, without doing anything. This is the reason why we organize with the conveners here, the African Development Bank, the IFRC, the FAO, and the African Union. We decided to organize this conference, the high-level conference, in order to prepare as well for next year's conference that the chairperson of the African Union, President Macky Sall, is going to organize in January. So this is a baseline, because we want to go to Senegal with really concrete action, concrete proposal, so that at the political level, we will come with solution. So we are working. And I also like to commend the African Development Bank, who joins us here, to take really response due to all these shocks. So we have a facility today, the African Emergency Food Production Facility by the African Development Bank, who put in our, who financed $1.5 billion for cereal production on the continent. And 4 commodities were selected, which is wheat, maize, soybeans, and rice. So this project is on, as we are saying, as a response to all these factors, COVID-19 pandemic, and now Ukraine and the Russian crisis. So we are really on track. And then we also had the support from the Afrexim Bank, which is our bank, a continental bank, for ATEX in order to solve the issue of fertilizer. So we have that support as well from the Afrexim Bank. And we also have a support from the World Bank because of the Horn of Africa, which is really a problem, and Southern region. So we have $2.5 billion to really address the issue of food resilience on the continent. on our continent. So we are working, and this conference is not a conference just to talk, it's the conference to take away considerable areas where we have to address and when we have action. Our new vision here is action, 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 implementation, 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 the tools we have. So we want to really, take our responsibility as a continent to mitigate the effect of food insecurity.
Thank you very much, Excellency. We move on now to Dr. Beth Danford of the African Development Bank. You have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. Dr. Beth Danford, the VP, is not here. My name is Martin Fregin. I'm the Director of Agriculture and Agro-Industry at the African Development Bank. As you have heard, Commissioner Sacco said, the African Development Bank is committed to ensuring that the current situation of where 30% of Africans face hunger and about 35% of the children are stunted is reversed. We believe very strongly that this is Africa's time to take a hold of the food security situation and turn it around. Number one, we have the technologies to raise productivity and produce enough food for every African man, woman, and child. Those technologies exist. You've seen how Ethiopia has taken heat-tolerant wheat varieties and transformed the lowlands of Ethiopia. I've seen it myself into wheat bread baskets. And this year, Ethiopia did not import wheat. Next year, Ethiopia is probably most likely going to export wheat, all because of technologies. The technologies exist. Number two, the policies and institutional reforms that are needed to transform agriculture, we know them. Policy reforms, with respect to input seeds, production of certified seeds, early generation seeds, policies in respect to finance for agriculture, providing credit guarantees or risk-sharing facilities for commercial banks to lend more to agriculture, policies around rural infrastructure, around storage. We know these policies, they do exist. And thirdly, the third tripod of this tool upon which agricultural transformation stands is political commitment. Commitment by governments to implement these policies, institutional reforms, commitment by government to ensure that these technologies get into the hands of farmers. That's what is needed now. That is probably the missing ingredient. Where you see commitment like in Ethiopia, where you see commitment like in Tanzania, see commitment like in Rwanda, like in Kenya, there is commensurate increase in food production. So we at the African Development Bank are telling African nations and telling our regional member countries, they are our shareholders, so we can talk to them. We are telling them that technologies exist. You have seen how it has transformed wheat in Ethiopia. Policy and institutional reforms are known. Now you need to commit. That is why we have convened this meeting that you heard Commissioner Sacco talk about in Dakar next year. We want the heads of states to come and chair boardrooms where commitments and resources and technologies will be discussed to ensure that every African nation can produce enough food to feed itself. It's not rocket science. Asia has done it. Latin America has done it. Europe and the US did it much earlier. Africa is not different. We can also do it, as has been demonstrated in some countries already. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We move on now to Dr. Abebe Haile Gabriel of the FAO. Dr. Abebe, you have the floor.
Thank you, Winnie. Let me also join colleagues for thanking members of the press, for the media, to join us. This is very important. The media plays a very important role in advocacy, passing across the messages to the different stakeholders. Now, you may have heard me starting my statement in the morning, complaining that Africa actually is backtracking. We're going backwards in terms of progress on food security and agriculture. And as a result, we have to face the challenges of hunger and malnutrition, not just now, but also unless we change course, we change direction, we learn how to do things differently and better, the situation is not going to go away. It's not going to get better. I gave you a kind of forecast projections by FAO of what would be the situation like by 2030. Remember, by 2030, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Agenda, goal number 2, ending hunger or zero hunger, meaning there will be no hunger by 2030. That's what we're aiming at. But 310 million people will go hungry by 2030 if the current trend is going to continue by 2030. This is alarming. We feel it, we see it happening. Communities, lives and livelihoods being shattered. There is no better example than what we see in the Horn of Africa at the moment. 4 seasons, 5 seasons of failure of production and the impact of that on the communities. Like 9 million, about 9 million livestock died in 3 countries, Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya. For the pastoralists, this means the children are not going to get any milk, and therefore they face direct the impact on nutrition. So it is not academic. The vulnerability is huge. The lives and livelihood of our people on the continent is very vulnerable. And we are dealing with multiple and overlapping crises. We have mentioned them. So in the face of this crisis and huge vulnerability, both inside as well as to external shocks, what needs to be done? I think we need to focus on building resilience. On building resilience and investment in transforming the agri-food systems. When we talk about investment, let's not forget about the smallholder farmers. They are the ones who should be making the investment. Government is not going to solve all the problems. And if you heard from my statement in the morning, I was using examples from northeastern Nigeria. Small investments, I was talking about less than $100, and the impact that was going to have on food security and nutrition of the family for a number of months. So let's focus on the solutions. And these solutions are not necessarily expensive. They can be affordable if we can work together. But I think in conferences like this one, which is very important, what reminds us is that unless Africa addresses squarely and strategically the issue of food and agriculture, we are not going to make any progress in all other sectors as well. Not on health, not on industrialization on industries, not on AFCFTA, not anything else. Agriculture is key. And this has been the missing link. Even though we have a lot of commitments in the past, the real commitment measured in terms of indicators such as investment is not really substantial. So this conference, one of its objectives is to make strong advocacy for support to agriculture and food systems transformation in the short term to protect the livelihoods and lives of people through strengthening social protection, through strengthening early warning system, but also in the medium and long term to boost production and productivity and competitiveness. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abebe. Last but not least, let me call upon Mr. Francesco Rocca of the IFRC. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, let me reiterate my gratitude to the colleagues and the co-conveners for this opportunity, which is really an important one, as my colleagues just said. That I don't want to repeat, I want to maybe echo what Commissioner Sacco and my colleagues said about the importance of this meeting and also how, also through this moment with the media, we can disseminate the importance. But also let me use this momentum to also try to disseminate, ironically, my and the frustration of the humanitarians after so many years of failures of the international community. This is not my first time here in this continent. This is not the first time that we have seen this kind of crisis in the continent. I've been here in 2011. I still remember the tears in the mothers in Turkana. After then in 2017, and now again. And starting, if you look back in 1984. But what is inexcusable now and today is, just as my colleagues of Theos just said, we have all the tools to prevent this to happen. So for us, the call is to walk the talk, because in too many occasions, and I remember I was in Rome, living in Rome, I had the privilege to attend a meeting in FEO in 2011 when everyone was shaking and making emotional speech about our being late, listening all the representatives from the international community and the donors. But once again, we are still at the brink of another tragedy. Still, our volunteers on the ground are drying the tears of mothers. And not, well, I hate to be rhetorical, to be honest. But I don't find another words when I meet my volunteers, the volunteers of the Red Cross, the Crescent, that are an expression of the community, and being a volunteer myself, because no one is paying me to be here. I've decided this must be part of my life. So I also have the privilege to be a bit more free than anyone else in saying what I feel. And what I feel today is frustration. And that there are no human beings of A serious and B serious. And I hate when I listen that maybe the Ukrainian crisis is part of the responsibility of what is happening in Africa now. No, it's not true, because we knew even before that the Ukrainian crisis started, that this was going to happen. And what is going to happen next year if there is not a strong intervention of the international community, of course, together with the African leaders, because this cannot be done. This must be led by the African leaders. No one must never be a substitute of the African leaders. They must take the leadership in addressing it. We have to support. This is also why, and with this I close, I also asked to the international community and my colleagues to change the narrative. I'm fed up in listening the role of the so-called implementing partners. No. The donors are the financial implementing partners, those who have the responsibility to make the strategy. This must be and must become the new reality. So with this, I'm at your disposal if you have any question and answer. But once again, I want to thank all the co-conveners for this great opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rocca. So our colleagues from the media, we have a few minutes for a Q&A. Let me see with a show of hands, those who have a question to ask. And once we've identified you, please tell us your name the agency that you're representing, and then also direct your question at one specific individual because we don't have a lot of time left. All right, there is a hand that has gone up immediately to my right. Let me see if there is another hand. There's another hand here to the left and another hand in the middle. So let's go in that order. Let's start from the right-hand side. Please try to ask one question per person so that we can cover as many colleagues as possible.
Is this on? Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for the press conference. My question is my name is Fred Harter, and I'm a reporter for the Africa Reports business magazine. My question is for Dr. Abebe from the FAO. You said that agriculture is key and that other progress cannot be made in other sectors until things like productivity, competitiveness in agriculture is improved. This has been identified as an issue within the continent for a long time. Why do you think progress has been so slow to improve these things?
Thank you. Dr. Abebe will take note. Let's go to the second question.
Well, my name is Desta from Ethiopian News Agency, and my question similarly goes to Mr. Abebe. And as it has been clearly stated by Mr. Roka, and the donors should do the financial investment while the countries are obligated and responsible for doing all the strategic implementation. As to that, what is a critical support from FAO and others with regard to Ethiopia's undertaking of recently the commercialization of summer wheat to produce and enhance productivity throughout the year, including summer and winter, and similarly, and replicate it into other countries too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abebe. That's another question for you. There was another hand in the middle. Please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Muluna from Shinwa News Agency. I want you to comment on more about the impacts of the crisis, the Ukraine crisis in food security in Africa. And is there any measure being taken to import food from other parts of the world, like from China and other countries? Thank you.
Who is your question directed at? Who is your question directed at?
Just for her, Ambassador Sako. Thank you.
To the commissioner. All right, colleagues, we will not come back for another round in the interest of time. So if you have a burning question, please just put it forward now. All right, let's continue now, starting with Commissioner.
Thank you. I will first of all thank you for this question and invite you to attend. There will be a section that we are going to talk about the impact of Russia, Ukraine, in Africa. But I just want to be very shortly to say that yes, there is an impact, mostly on fertilizer. Mostly on fertilizer because 30% of our imports for fertilizer is the two countries. So it's really affecting us. But in terms of cereals, apart from the northern region of Africa, the Maghreb, the northern region of Africa, in the sub-Saharan Africa, we have also our native foods that we eat. We don't consume much bread. I want to talk globally in terms of the continent. There are some countries that are really dependent on wheat, but 70% of our population, 70% of our population are rural, and they take really to make a concrete, assessment of this crisis is a little bit difficult, but we have facts. We have got facts, and the facts we are going to present is one of the panel that we are going to present so that you have more elements for you to disseminate this information. I thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. Dr. Abebe, you had 2 questions.
Thank you so much for those 2 questions. The first one is a very interesting question, very general. I wish I could write a book about it. You see, if you compare the level of productivity, take yield of cereals, for example, and compare the African figures with the average for developing countries. It's not for world average, it's not for developed countries. I say average developing countries. The Africa average yield is about 1/3 of that. You see, it is very, very low. Your question is, why isn't change, positive change, was not happening, despite the fact that there has been a lot. CAADP, the Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Program, was adopted when? In 2003. How many years now? We have been really making advocacy for increased productivity of agriculture. Why is it not happening? If I can give you one reason, I would say lack of real political ownership and commitment. Because we have seen it where there is national ownership, political commitment, real commitment, not just phony commitment, real commitment. Things have happened. The example mentioned about Ethiopian wheat production in the last couple of years, but rice, look at the development in rice in Africa. There has been a kind of movement towards rice self-sufficiency in Africa, and the progress in several countries, in Tanzania, in Nigeria, in Senegal, many countries, it is remarkable. This is happening because there is real ownership and commitment. Commitment measured in terms of investment. Research institutions, our research institutions, they do research, they come up with improved varieties and other improved agronomic practices and so on. They get published, they stay on the shelves. They don't find their way to the farmer's field. The farmers, they are left for themselves. I talked about vulnerability. It's with reason. So there are so many reasons to mention, but it's just, you see, policies matter, and policies are implemented by the government mainly. And that is where I just want to emphasize. Investment is a key, but I don't want to say it alone because it requires ownership. And the second question, what is FAO doing? Well, FAO is not a donor organization, just for you, it's a technical organization. We have been working with our member countries, including on Ethiopia, to support the efforts of the national priorities and policies. Let's emphasize this. If something has to be happened in real terms, it must be led by the national system. Donors or any other partner will not bring solution. It is the national policies, strategies, and so on. So our role is to support that. And I can give you examples of how we support. We support evidence-based policy formulation, for example, as well as implementation, providing real-time data to make informed decisions on policy. We facilitate experience sharing of best practices and lessons because using FAO's extensive network globally, what works, where, how, and under what conditions. We provide that kind of platform. We support scaling up of proven approaches and technologies and promote investments. And we mobilize partnerships, including donor partners around the issue of agricultural transformation. I can give you examples of how we support the efforts of Ethiopia, for example, among 25 other African countries through what we call hand-in-hand initiative. This is just one example, using best approaches that work. I think I can give you a lot of information, but time would be limited. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abebe. Let me advise those colleagues from the media who still have outstanding questions that you can contact Molalet, our communications officer, as well as Peace, who is here. Peace, if you can just raise your hand so that they can see you. For any follow-ups that you might want to do. But at this point, it is time for us to close this press briefing with much thanks to Her Excellency Ambassador Josefa Sako, the Commissioner for Agriculture, Rural Development, Blue Economy and Sustainable Environment at the African Union Commission, the representative of the African Development Bank, Dr. Martin, Dr. Abebe Haley Gabriel from the Food and Agriculture Organization, as well as Mr. Francesco Roca from the IFRC. This brings us to the end of this briefing. We now leave it up to the conveners to continue with the rest of the conference. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.